Welcome to the latest episode of the Small Triumph Sports Library and Archives channel. This will be a brief, mostly unscripted video in which I provide a update on the Spitfire Electrickery I'm dealing with, as well as another problem that came up in the process of trying to diagnose that Electrickery. But before I get to that content, I do want to say that I have been working on the video that will feature an update on my GT6 project. I've taken photos, I've shot videos, I've done some scripting, I've done some editing. So I just wanted to say that that is definitely in progress. I'm not under the illusion that there are lots of people out there waiting with bated breath for that video to be posted. But I have been teasing it for a while and I've yet to deliver, and I just wanted to say that I am working on it and it will be out hopefully within a week. I have been holding out hope that I might be able to resolve a certain problem with that project prior to posting the video so that I can make the resolution of that problem part of the video. However, that's probably unlikely, and wherever I am when I get the video ready to go, I'll go ahead and post it and deal with any loose ends later on. Okay, so primary purpose here is to provide an update on the Spitfire Electrickery, or at least that was my initial primary goal here. And unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot to say. For those of you who may not know, you can go back and look at my original video about the Spitfire Electrickery. I'll provide a link down below. But the short version of the story is that I was out driving, I was exiting a gas station, and I lost all power. Engine died, didn't have any lights on the instruments, radio died, everything. I messed with the key, messed with the switch a little bit, and came back to life. I drove it home. I was able to get the problem to reoccur in the driveway a little bit, and then it stopped. And every time I have started the car or driven the car since, it hasn't missed a beat. And so that's really what I have to report. I have run the car several times since I did that video, and I even took it out for about a 30-minute drive, and it has been just fine. Haven't been any problems. I did double check some things. I do believe that in all likelihood the ignition switch is giving warning signs that it's on its way out. But I am no fan of spending $125 to $150 on a part based on a hunch or a guess, even an educated guess. It's not a sound way to operate. So I really would like to clearly isolate and identify the problem instead of just starting to replace parts based on assumptions. That can work out, but it can also cause you to spend a lot of money unnecessarily, and I have some experience with that with the Spitfire and with some other projects. So I'm going to keep driving the car. I'm going to see what happens. But again, car really hasn't missed a beat. I have not tested the car as much as I would really probably like to. And part of that is because we're just entering a time of year here in the South where it's not a lot of fun to drive. It's not a lot of fun to drive classic cars. It's not a lot of fun to ride motorcycles. It's always 95 plus degrees and extremely humid. And my Spitfire in particular, it'll cruise along at highway speeds just fine in that hot weather and high humidity, but it does not like being in stop and go traffic. It doesn't like sitting at stoplights or anything like that. It's very unhappy. On top of the fact that it's pretty uncomfortable for the driver. I can recall many times back when the Spitfire was my only car arriving places in the summer just covered in sweat. It was a pretty regular occurrence back in those days, actually. So not my favorite time to drive overall, but I will get the car out early some mornings before summer wraps up and keep driving it, and we'll see what happens. Hopefully I'll be able to clearly identify the problem and order the necessary parts, assuming that's what's needed, parts needed, and we'll see what happens. That allows me to shift to a problem that came up as part of the larger project with Spitfire Electrickery, and this has to do with my hazard light switch on the Spitfire. It is one of the switches with the pull knobs on it. I believe it was around 1975 that Triumph changed the hazard light switch in Spitfires from the rocker type switch, the type that is in my 1969 GT6, and went with the pull type hazard switch. So I'm contemplating taking the car out, driving it to test it, knowing that one day at least I lost all power, and I'm thinking about the prospect of pulling out into traffic and suddenly losing power, especially in my tiny Spitfire. And so I decided to test the hazard warning lights. I religiously check the lights in the car. I check the brake lights, I check the turn signals, I check all those things regularly, but for the first time it occurred to me that I never check hazard warning lights. I don't know why. I couldn't have told you the last time prior to this current episode I'm speaking of. I couldn't tell you the last time that I pulled the hazard knob, looked at or tested the switch, which is bad on me. It's something I should test, but I just didn't. So I'm thinking about taking the car out for a drive, knowing that sudden power loss is possible given recent experience. I guess it's always possible, but is maybe unusually possible given recent experience. And so I decided I'm going to test the hazard warning lights, and so I pull the knob and I get nothing at all. Let's press it back in, I pull it out again, nothing. Press it back in. Well, obviously I want my hazard lights to be able to work. It might not save me if I pull out in traffic and the car suddenly dies, but it's a good thing to have for sure. So I was thinking about it, and I know that when the car was my daily driver back in the early, mid, into the late 90s, everything on the car worked. I know the hazard light switch worked. And I thought it was unlikely that the hazard switch was broken, but anything's possible, I guess. So I started thinking about investigating, and I looked at the workshop manual and saw that the workshop manual says you need to take either the speedometer or the tachometer out and reach in behind, and it was kind of a larger project than I really wanted to partake in. But as I was investigating, I was looking online, and I just happened to see in an online forum that there was another Spitfire owner, and he said his hazard light switch didn't work, and his friend happened to be a mechanic, and that his friend had suggested spraying a lot of contact cleaner in the switch and just working it. And I thought, that's probably the problem with my switch. I can't remember the last time I operated it. It probably has a little bit of corrosion on it, so I should try that. So I went out to the car and, I pulled and pushed the knob a number of times. And at first it seemed hopeless because none of the lights were coming on that I could see. And I was mostly sitting in the driver's seat staring straight ahead. But probably about the sixth time I pulled it out, I saw a flash. I think it may have only been from the right-hand side turn signal, but finally I saw a flash, and of course that was an important sign of hope. So I kept pulling it and pushing it in, and sure enough, all the lights eventually came on, and eventually they all started to come on consistently. So that was a win. I did go in and kind of spray the switch with some contact cleaner, made sure it was operating consistently. There was one problem I noticed though, and that is that the light in the knob was not flashing. And there's a backstory to this that is kind of important. I unscrewed the knob and quickly realized that the bulb was loose in there. And I remember immediately thinking, there's supposed to be a spring in this knob, because I can remember in the past, it had been a while, but I remember in the past having to screw that knob on with resistance on it and how it was kind of fiddly. And it's really one of the reasons that those knobs often don't last for very long. And the story with that is that I had replaced my knob at one point. My original one cracked. Again, these are plastic knobs. They're screwing on the metal of a switch, and it's not that difficult to strip out the threads, and it's not that difficult to over tighten them and crack the knob. So they often don't last if you're not careful with them. And so my original knob had broken, and they weren't really readily available on the market for a while. And eventually I saw one available at Spitbits. This was some years ago. And it wasn't exactly like the original one. It's kind of a translucent dark cherry red, and it had kind of black paint or very dark red paint on the end of the knob. I'll show you what it looks like in just a second. But, it wasn't exactly right, but it was perfectly functional. And so I had put that on the car. However, probably within the last, I'll say 4 or 5 years, the Roadster factory started advertising that they had the correct hazard switch knob in the correct red color, which is more of kind of a brilliant red color. And so I'd ordered a couple of those. And what happened is one day on a whim, I just decided I was going to swap out the knob. So I took the knob that didn't really look right off, and I put the one that looked correct on. And I just did it really quick. I just walked out to the garage and did it. Didn't really pay a lot of attention. Well, when I pulled that knob off this time and saw the bulb was in there loosely, I was like, oh, I hope I didn't lose the spring. I know there's supposed to be a spring in there. And I started thinking about, I'm going to have to fabricate a spring, which can be done. It's not necessarily be the end of the world. But I did decide that I needed to go and look at the old knob and see if somehow the spring was still stuck in there. So I dug in my drawer, pulled out the knob that I had pulled off, the Spitbits knob, and sure enough, the spring was in the knob. So pulled it out of that knob, put it in the new knob, and everything was fine and dandy from there. However, I learned some interesting things about the factory publications related to the hazard light switch as I went through this process. So let me go ahead and show you some things here. First of all, this is an image of the knobs in question. The one on the left is one that I got from Spitbits quite a few years ago. And as you can see, it's kind of this dark translucent red on the body of it, and then the end of the knob is painted this maybe a black red, almost black color on the end. It's a perfectly functional knob, just doesn't look like the original one. The one on the right is the one that I purchased from the Roadster factory, and it is it appears far more like the original one if it's not an exact copy of it. It's a brilliant red color. The arrangement of the knob and the spring and the bulb is as I'm showing here. So you have the knob, you have the spring, which has a big loop on it. As I understand it from taking apart my original knob, that big loop goes into the knob as shown and rests against the face of the knob. And then the spring provides tension on the bulb to keep it held in the switch so it will illuminate And here's an image of the spring from a different angle. What I found interesting is I was trying to figure out the exact arrangement. My memory was not that great. I pulled the knob off, the bulb fell out. I was like, this is not how it's supposed to be. And I was racking my brains about how it was supposed to be, and I was confident there was supposed to be a spring in there, but I wanted to make sure. So I looked at the factory workshop manual, I looked at the owner's manuals, I looked at the maintenance handbooks that came with the late cars, and I didn't do a deep dive, but as far as I can tell, none of them covered how to service the bulb in the hazard light switch. So I went to the factory parts catalog. The February 1981 edition of the factory parts catalog shows the switch knob, the bulb, and the spring. But as you can see here, this is the image from the Spitfire 1500 1975 on factory parts catalog, issued February 1981. And you can see the order of those parts is not correct here. It's the knob, the bulb, the spring. That's not how it's supposed to be. It is supposed to be as I show it here, where you've got the knob, the spring, and the bulb. However, while this factory parts catalog image is not correct, I was looking around, and again, I didn't do a deep dive, but I was looking around and I noticed in the Moss Motors catalog, they actually have an image that shows the hazard light switch with the different pieces oriented correctly. Again, this is from the Moss Motors catalog, the electrical section dealing with the dash. And there you see the switch knob, the spring, and then the bulb, and then the switch. It is a fiddly process to get that switch knob on. It's very easy to see how they get broken, they get over tightened, they get stripped out. It's very easy to get them cocked and started, and it's pretty easy to chew up the threads in those knobs. So it's a fiddly job, and you have to be very, very careful with it. But I did want to take this opportunity to emphasize that while the factory publications are, let's say, 99.8% accurate, they're not accurate all the time. I've found a number of mistakes in workshop manuals and owner's handbooks and things like that. Also, not every operation that an owner needs appears in these publications either. And that's certainly the case as far as I can tell. Again, maybe I'll find something in the future where I missed some page in one of the books or something, but I do not think that servicing the hazard switch knob is actually covered by Triumph in any of its publications. So you can imagine, and one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story is you can imagine that if you're a novice, if the previous owner has broken the hazard knob or put the hazard knob back together incorrectly and you're trying to figure out why it's not working properly, you're not going to find information on how to repair that in any of the factory publications. And if you go to the factory parts catalog, you're going to find an image where things are not oriented correctly. The Moss catalog, of course, that image probably comes from some factory publication, possibly an earlier catalog for the Spitfire that I just don't happen to have. My guess is that comes from a factory publication that does show, the correct orientation for the knob. But the bottom line is you can be thrown off. It's one of the reasons why it's really great that we have some of the communities that we have, so you can jump on the internet and say, hey, how does this go? But how does this go together? How does this work? And people will chime in and help you out, although they're not always right about things either, including yours truly. Okay. So I went in, I cleaned everything up, I repaired my hazard light switch, and ended up with a perfectly working, functioning hazard light system. So there is my update on the Spitfire Electrickery I've been experiencing, as well as a tale about my adventures with the hazard warning light switch, specifically the orientation of the knob, spring, and bulb in that hazard knob assembly. But also some important words about how you need to exercise your hazard warning system. Um, Maybe exorcise it sometimes, but exercise that system sometimes to ensure that it works. Don't be a dope like me, and when you're testing your headlamps and your tail lamps and your brake lights and your turn signal lights and all that, don't forget to also test your hazard warning lights. They can be useful things. They can come in handy, and you want them to be there when you need them. Um, so that's it for this episode. I should be back within about a week this time with my GT6 project update. Till next time, cheers.